Right, I agree. Thank you.
This movie scene depicts Brigadier General James Gavin, commanding the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, discussing planned parachute and glider landings near the Dutch city of Nijmegen in September 1944 with a Dutch liaison officer, Captain Arie Dirk Harry Bestebroitje.
It's going to take 3 days to get the men into Arnhem, Poles and the British.
How about us?
We'll be all right. Aside from the fact that we're parachuting in daylight, we have nothing to worry about.
Daylight? Has it ever been tried before?
Not in a major drop.
You think there might be a reason for that?
Let's hope not.
I don't want to hear anything else. Is there anything else?
Well, you're my Dutch advisor, Harry.
I forgot to tell you something.
Only that the Germans first tried to take Nijmegen Bridge themselves back in 1940 and got slaughtered.
The dialogue is lighthearted relief in a serious war drama, but also cleverly increases the stakes for the Americans. The audience is told that 4 years earlier, German soldiers had apparently attempted the same mission that Gavin's American soldiers would be attempting, and that the mission had been so dangerous that it failed with great loss of life. It may be no surprise to learn that the film exaggerated the events of 1940 for dramatic effect. While the Germans did employ parachute and glider troops in May 1940 during the invasion of the Netherlands, there was no airborne attack on the bridges at Nijmegen. A battalion group of foot soldiers from the German 254th Infantry Division crossed with assault boats and a captured ferry on the first day of the invasion of the West. The city of Nijmegen was taken, and the Germans quickly continued west, deeper into the Netherlands, supporting the main drive into France and Sedan farther south. The Netherlands was occupied by the Germans for long years until 1944, when the Western Allies returned to the continent. In September, the Germans found themselves defending Nijmegen, and the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, supported by the Guards Armored Division, launched their own river crossing. It was a unique situation, American and British soldiers fighting in and around the same geographical objectives that the Germans had fought for over 4 years earlier. That pattern repeated itself during the fighting to liberate the Netherlands in 1944 and 1945. This 900-page book, published in 2002, gives a detailed account of one of the most unique battlefields of the war. The narrow causeway between Walcheren Island and the South Beveland Peninsula, known locally as the Sloedam, was also the scene of two major combat assaults, firstly in 1940 during the German invasion of the West, and then again nearly 4.5 years later in 1944 during the Allied liberation of the Netherlands. The two battles for the causeway have remained relatively obscure. The strategic situation and the canalizing nature of the terrain meant only small forces could be deployed there at any one time. The 1940 action came at the tail end of a swift and successful invasion, in which the Allies were in full retreat, while the attacking Germans were mopping up a largely defeated enemy. The assault in 1944 was intended only as a diversion from a more dramatic event occurring on the other side of Walcheren Island.
The landing craft head towards the flashing beaches in the early morning light.
Mentions of the fighting there and official accounts of the war have been brief. The Dutch government in exile published their first history of the 1940 campaign during the war, and the Sloedam is mentioned only in passing. Likewise, the first official historical summary of the Canadian Army in the Second World War was published just 3 years after the shooting stopped, and devoted only a single paragraph to the later Causeway Battle of 1944. A fuller official history of the Canadian Army's campaign in Northwest Europe, published in 1960, expanded coverage of the Causeway Battle to 4 pages, while the British official war history devoted just 2 pages to the Causeway Battle. By contrast, this recent detailed history of the fighting for the island contains just a single paragraph about the Causeway. Not unusually, the histories of the individual units that fought there have been the most detailed, and Roy Farran's history of the Calgary Highlanders, published in 1955, has one of the most dramatic tellings. The well-traveled SAS veteran generously called the attack by the Highlanders on the Causeway one of the most brazen frontal assaults in history. The publication of Slagveld Sloedam in 2002 finally told the full story of how the Walcheren Island Causeway was fought over by men from 5 different nations. Memory of those battles is preserved by monuments at the western end of the former causeway, and the battle briefly rose to wider public notice when the Dutch film The Forgotten Battle was released in 2020. This video will examine the military history of the Sloedam and how the battles there have been remembered in the years since the Second World War. The modern history of the Netherlands dates back to the 17th century, when the Dutch people earned sovereignty from the Spanish and evolved into a democratic constitutional monarchy. Accidents of geography placed the Dutch in control of the mouth of many vital European waterways, including the Scheldt estuary, the Meuse and Rhine rivers, and while France, Britain, and Germany all had economic interests in these waterways, a sort of mutual deterrence developed, which kept them from attacking the Netherlands in the First World War. Despite economic harms inflicted by the war and the Great Depression, the Netherlands grew to over 8.5 million people, and arable land increased as they ramped up their centuries-long practice of land reclamation, erecting dikes and dams to keep water out of areas below sea level, which could then be used for habitation and agriculture. The Netherlands again remained neutral when Britain and France declared war on Germany in September 1939. After the surrender of Poland in October, Hitler immediately began planning the conquest of Western Europe. Brief consideration was given to bypassing the Netherlands during the invasion of France, but the final plan called for a major attack on the first day of the campaign in order to rapidly destroy Dutch forces, occupy the Netherlands, and deny their territory to the British and French. The Dutch were slow to prepare for invasion, and in January 1940 a set of German plans fell into Allied hands, making it clear that combat against German forces would be inevitable. German officers opposed to Hitler also leaked news of the coming invasion to the Dutch. Even with this advance notice, liaisons between the Dutch and French and British officers produced much discord and no clear blueprint for what military cooperation would look like. The Dutch had a number of defensive lines planned, mostly just strings of bunkers with nothing arrayed behind in depth, and modern fortifications, such as the Maisonneuves line forts or the Belgian fortress of Eben-Eenmaal, for the most part simply didn't exist. The Dutch were conspicuously short of tanks, mortars, and field radios. While Dutch forces concentrated on defending in the northern and eastern provinces, the French and Germans both paid particular attention to the provinces of Zeeland and Holland in their planning. In the event of rapid Dutch collapse, the French planned to operate around Antwerp and keep German forces from being able to stage in Zeeland for operations against the United Kingdom and the Thames estuary. For months, neither side made any major moves, a period known as the Phony War. It ended in April 1940 when Denmark fell easily to the Germans. Norway held out for 2 months with British and French help before surrendering. In the meantime, German forces attacked France in the Low Countries on May 10th. Just 5 days later, Dutch forces were also compelled to surrender. The agreement signed on May 15th did not include the province of Zeeland, where French and Dutch troops continued to resist. The island of Walcheren contained the naval port at Flushing and controlled access to the Scheldt estuary, the waterway leading into the port at Antwerp. The farther east the Germans could be held, the more troops could be evacuated through Flushing and redeployed to France to fight another day. The Dutch were still able to muster 8 battalions and some naval troops, concentrating them on South Beveland, the peninsula east of Walcheren. On 15 May, the same day the official Dutch surrender was signed, German forces were already attacking the Zondyke position, a defensive line along the isthmus. Spearheading the drive west through South Beveland was the SS Verfügungsdivision, the forerunners of the Waffen-SS. The division included 3 motorized infantry regiments named Deutschland, Germania, and Der Führer. After the surrender of the Dutch government, the SS division was ordered to mop up what remained in the Netherlands, while the bulk of the German army drove south into France. The Deutschland regiment attacked the Zondyke position at 0800 on 15 May. They were repelled, but artillery and dive bomber attacks caused the Allied troops to abandon the line by early afternoon. The next day, Deutschland advanced west to the Beveland Canal, where the French 271st Infantry Regiment and 3 Dutch battalions had already been routed by an air bombardment. The way was open to Walcheren Island and crushing all Allied resistance north of the Scheldt. However, one obstacle remained, with extremely unique terrain which presented a very challenging tactical problem to whichever commander would be called on to face it. Travelers to Zeeland today would not be able to recognize the site of the old Walcheren Causeway, as Dutch land reclamation has continued steadily since the war. What today are farmers' fields looked much different in the Second World War. In the 1940s, the island of Walcheren was separated from the South Beveland Peninsula by the Sloe Channel, across which tidal mudflats effectively blocked foot and vehicular traffic. At high tide, the water was not deep enough for boats. At low tide, the ground was too marshy to walk or drive across. The only land link between Walcheren Island and South Beveland was a narrow causeway known locally as the Sloedam, literally a dam across the Sloe Channel, and more commonly known in English as the Walcheren Island Causeway. The Sloedam was built in 1871 specifically to link the port city of Flushing to the mainland. The causeway was 1,600 meters long and 40 meters wide and carried a hard-surfaced road, railway track, bicycle path, line of telegraph poles, and a row of poplars. At the time of the surrender of the Netherlands, the French and Dutch troops remaining in Zeeland continued to withdraw across the causeway, making for the port of Flushing on Walcheren Island for embarkation, so they could be redeployed to France to continue fighting. By 16 May, only a small defensive position stood between the SS troops and the Sloedam, with a handful of French motorcycle troops and infantry in place as a rear guard. The sector was so far west in the Netherlands that no permanent defenses had been erected, and the French manned two hastily built defensive lines, an advanced position east of the causeway, and the main line at the west end. There were no bunkers or barbed wire. The French did blow up the rail line and set up their artillery, and put foxholes with infantrymen in them at the access road and along the seawall on both sides of the causeway entrance. At 1400 hours on 16 May, the 3rd Company of the SS Division's Reconnaissance Battalion sent out a 4-vehicle patrol of 4 and 8-wheeled armored cars. Allied engineers had wrecked the bridges on the Beveland Canal, and by the time they crossed the canal on a ferry, they had just 90 minutes to reach the Sloedam before darkness. The terrain was flat, so the armored cars opened up to 70 kilometers per hour and drove for the causeway. The 8-wheeled armored cars outstripped the others and made contact with the French between Leeuwarden and the eastern end of the causeway, coming under mortar and anti-tank fire. The lead vehicle was hit by armor-piercing shells and forced to retire, but not before their 2-centimeter guns scored hits on 2 French anti-aircraft guns. 1 SS man was killed and 3 wounded in the clash. Fritz Langanke was a radio operator and second driver in the other armored car. German armored cars had 2 sets of steering controls, one for driving forward, and a second driver who could drive the armored car in reverse with a rear-facing seat and steering wheel. On 16 May, Langanke's arm was in a sling from an earlier motorcycle collision, and it took both he and the main driver to operate the controls and get their armored car under cover after the lead vehicle was hit. When they attempted to recover the radio codes from the patrol commander in the first vehicle, Langanke found the card covered in so much blood it was unreadable. Langanke was commissioned later in the war and received the Knight's Cross as a tank commander on the Eastern Front. On this day, however, their mission was a failure and the French outposts east of the Sloedam remained intact. Unable to get past the French defenses, the Germans realized there was no chance of a lightning move over the Walcheren Causeway, and the regiments following behind the SS reconnaissance troops realized there would have to be a deliberate assault in daylight the next day. The divisional war diary noted, "The advance elements of Battle Group Kleinheisterkamp, named for the commander of the 1st Battalion of Deutschland, arrived in the evening of the 16th and prepared to attack the Sloedam the next day." Unknown to the Germans, the French troops east of the causeway had pulled back after darkness and reorganized. The French 271st Infantry Regiment had been reduced to 500 men, or about 3 companies, with about 100 other stragglers rearmed with Dutch weapons and ammunition. Remnants of the French 224th Infantry Regiment were also deployed across the western side of the Sloe Channel in order to hold the causeway, supported by anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery. The ability of the guns and mortars to fire indirectly, that is, without seeing their targets, was hampered by a lack of maps. One artillery commander resorted to using the Michelin hiking map out of desperation. A crater had been blown on the causeway itself, cutting the rail line. The stage was set for the events of May 17th. Military training manuals emphasize that a successful attack requires covering fire, flanking movements, and careful timing to tie the two together. The Walcheren Causeway therefore presented an incredibly tough challenge to a deliberate attack, since there was no ability to flank the defenders with the limited pool of resources available and the difficult terrain they would have to traverse. In the early morning hours of 17 May, an orders conference was held by SS Gruppenführer Paul Hauser, commanding the SS Verfügungsdivision. In attendance were SS Gendarmenführer Felix Steiner, commanding the SS Regiment Deutschland, and 2 of his battalion commanders, SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Witt and SS Obersturmbannführer Matthias Kleinheisterkamp. Just as the reconnaissance units had been delayed by the blown bridges over the Beveland Canal, so too was the supporting artillery of the SS division, and the attack on the Sloedam was postponed until 0920 hours local Dutch time. The 3rd Battalion of Deutschland was tasked with the initial assault, with the 1st Battalion to follow behind. The SS commanders all realized that with such a narrow, exposed approach, heavy fire support from artillery and aircraft would be necessary. In all, 2 batteries of light howitzers and 2 heavy artillery batteries were tasked to support the attack, with air support to be requested on demand. The Germans' estimate of defenses was 2 French companies with heavy infantry weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and weak supporting artillery. The 9th Company of SS Regiment Deutschland under SS Obersturmführer Paul Roda attacked under the cover of artillery fire at 0920. An initial smooth advance was stopped cold by artillery and machine gun fire, and the company pulled back with heavy losses. The call was made for air support, and Kampfgeschwader 4 sent a number of Heinkel 111 bombers over the western end of the Sloedam at 0950 hours, bombing artillery and anti-aircraft positions around Middelburg, Flushing, and Arnhem-Iden. The 9th Company had been dispersed by the French artillery fire, which did not slacken. Additional fire support came from French and British warships offshore, as well as French 155mm guns manned by naval personnel and located near Breskens. The author of Slagveld's Sloedam surmised that this fire was likely very inaccurate owing to the poor maps and may have fallen as far from the Sloedam as Middelburg. The French rearguards had been shaken by the German bombers, but General de Laurence put in a personal appearance and rallied the defenders. An SS man of the 9th Company later wrote that the French had placed automatic weapons and guns behind a concrete wall, firing through embrasures. The 9th Company put in another attack and was withdrawn with over a dozen dead and 30 wounded, including the company commander. A new call for air support went out, this time for fighter planes. Ordered into a third attack, the SS men inched forward under constantly shifting supporting artillery fires. Their only cover was a small knee-high hedge beside the main road. Between pauses in the French fire, they continued to press forward until they reached within 100 meters at the far end. A final volley of hand grenades got the SS men into a French trench line running perpendicular to the road and rail track on the Sloedam. At about 10:50 hours, the 9th Company, with support from No. 10 Company following behind, could report a small bridgehead had been formed, but remained under heavy French fire. The Dutch soldiers around the area had mostly been ignored by their French comrades because a clear command structure had never been organized. Reserve Captain Van de Broeke had stayed at his post near the dike overnight, despite an accidental shelling by French warships, and then the German air attacks during the morning's fighting. Van de Broeke had to scrounge food during the morning from a Navy headquarters in Flushing and nearby farms, and at about 1100 hours, just as the SS were reporting they had created a bridgehead across the Sloe, the Dutch pulled back to the south past Fort Rammekens. Requests by the French to reinforce the western defenses with a battalion of French Marines failed to crystallize any tangible support, and air cover also remained uncoordinated. One group of 8 Curtis Hawk fighters arrived later in the afternoon and fought an inconclusive dogfight with German Messerschmitts, in which both sides lost aircraft. In the meantime, several French counterattacks on the ground began in the early afternoon. Although all had been repelled by the Germans, the 9th Company of Deutschland had suffered too heavily to pursue them, and No. 10 Company inched forward while heavy French shelling of the Sloedam prevented further reinforcement of the German bridgehead. At 16:20 hours, a concentration of German artillery fire combined with dive bomber attacks convinced the last of the French troops to leave the shelter of the concrete wall. The French 224th and 271st Infantry regiments pulled out, and the race to get to Middelburg and Flushing ahead of the Germans was now on. Vehicles were organized for the remainder of the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Deutschland Regiment, with No. 15 Company leading the way. At 17:20 hours, the first Germans reached Arnhem-Iden. The SS men anticipated house-to-house fighting, but the town fell quickly. The 3rd Battalion was relieved by the 1st, and reached Nieuw-Sint-Joosland at about 1900 hours, overcoming another French rearguard of the 224th Infantry Regiment. Dutch troops had been able to offer no real resistance to the advancing Germans, and retreating French troops streamed back to Flushing. The Sloedam fighting was over. The 9th SS had lost 15 men killed and 45 wounded in total. 2 Dutch Marines were killed along with 33 French soldiers, the majority infantrymen from the 224th Infantry Regiment, which also lost 99 wounded. Among the casualties was General de Laurence, who had picked up a rifle and organized a last-ditch rearguard 400 meters from the embarkation points in Flushing. De Laurence was killed fighting with the men of the outpost, but the delay they inflicted on the German advance gave time for most of his command to embark by the time the evacuation stopped at 22:15. The fighting for the Sloedam had been the climax of the last act of the invasion of the Netherlands. The last smattering of Dutch forces there were withdrawn to Ostend in Belgium, and the last bit of Dutch territory fell to the Germans. To the south, German armored columns were racing for the French coast in an overwhelming victory that shocked the world. Official German occupation of the Netherlands began the same day that SS Regiment Deutschland stormed the Sloedam. The Dutch government fled the country and resolved to rule in exile, leaving the country to be run by a German civilian governor. For just over a year, the occupation was relatively benign, and the Dutch economy actually improved. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, German demands for resources and workers intensified. When plans for the final solution crystallized in early 1942, the Jewish population of the Netherlands suffered from harsh repression and deportation to concentration camps. By this time, the British Commando program caused a re-examination of German defenses in the West, even though the threat of invasion was deemed to be minimal. New divisions were created for coastal defense, and the newly raised German 39th Infantry Division moved into Coastal Defense Sector A1 in August 1942. The sector comprised Walcheren Island, North Beveland, South Beveland, and the area around Heiberge at the neck of the South Beveland Peninsula. Construction of fortifications ramped up with the creation of artillery positions, casemates, troop shelters, bunkers, and other assorted improved fighting positions. Every port city along the Atlantic coast was designated a strong point and expected to repel attacks from land, sea, and air. Areas in between the strong points and sectors were defended by smaller resistance nests, built for all-around defense with infantry positions, barbed wire, and minefields. These resistance nests could also be grouped into strong points. The 39th Infantry Division was relieved in October 1942 by another newly raised division, the 65th Infantry. Walcheren Island and North Beveland were considered to be the only parts of Coastal Defense Sector A1 to be at risk of Allied amphibious landings. South Beveland was earmarked as a German staging area where troops could form up to counterattack any landing beaches. At the end of 1942, the Atlantic Wall was reassessed again, and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, ordered a second line of defenses behind the coast to defend against invasion forces breaking through the coastline. This second line was to parallel the coast by about 10 kilometers, and mobile reserve forces were to be placed behind this second line. Walcheren was divided into four main areas, and subsector East Walcheren included Resistance Nest Moltke and Strongpoint Scharnhorst near the Sloedam, with 4 resistance nests. A Strongpoint Klinger was planned for Walcheren, but was never completed. The fortifications constructed in the subsector were designed on the premise that the enemy would be approaching from seaward. The 65th Infantry Division moved to Italy in the summer of 1943, where it earned the nickname the Hand Grenade Division. It was replaced in Zeeland by the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division, and later on the 154th Reserve Division. When the Allies landed in faraway Normandy in June 1944, the great mystery of where and when the Second Front would open ended. No one knew it at the time of D-Day, but the Atlantic Wall defenses on Walcheren Island still had a significant part to play in the grand strategy of the Northwest Europe campaign, and the Sloedam was destined to be a part of that story as well. The elaborate construction of the Atlantic Wall was emblematic of a problem that plagued both sides in the summer of 1944. They spent so much time preparing for the actual Allied landings that no one spent any serious time studying how to fight in the unique terrain of Normandy. Neither Americans nor Germans proved able to mount effective offensive operations in the bocage, while on the British and Canadian front, the high concentration of armored forces created a battle of attrition around Caen. The Americans broke out of the western end of the beachhead at the end of July using an assortment of creative solutions to the hedgerow problem, as well as carpet bombing of German frontline positions by heavy 4-engine bombers. British and Canadian troops fought their way between Caen and Falaise until the end of August, coming up with their own unique tactical solutions. When Allied troops landed in southern France at the end of the month, the collapse of German resistance in France resulted in a speedy push from Normandy to the German frontier. This rapid advance created a new problem: how to get supplies to the forward troops as they pursued the beaten Germans. The Allies had defied conventional military wisdom by deliberately not landing near a port facility, bringing artificial harbors to Normandy with them instead. One of these was damaged in a heavy June storm, but operations continued over open beaches. At the start of September, Allied supply lines stretched up to 500 kilometers from the Normandy beaches. In the run-up to D-Day, Allied bombers had wrecked the French rail system, and the Germans were either blowing up the French port facilities or in some cases refusing to surrender. Dunkirk and other ports remained in German hands until May 1945. In the meantime, the Allies were forced to use thousands of precious gallons of gasoline moving supplies forward to the rapidly moving front line, and 5 divisions had to sit idle in Normandy while the trucks were pressed into service to ferry supplies. The solution to the supply crisis was the massive dock facilities at Antwerp, captured intact by the British in September 1944. The port had serviced 11,000 ocean-going ships and 44,000 river vessels annually in peacetime, and promised to be the key to relieving the Allies' logistical problems. But Allied ships couldn't make the trip down the Scheldt estuary with their cargoes until the German coastal batteries on Walcheren Island were destroyed. These guns, and the minefields they covered, could sink any Allied ships trying to transit the narrow channel. At the start of September 1944, as this crisis was materializing, the Allied command structure changed and General Eisenhower assumed command of the land battle from newly promoted Field Marshal Montgomery. Desperate to employ their airborne divisions, the Allies drafted a bold plan to use parachute and glider troops to get across the Rhine River. Market Garden launched on 17 September on the front of the 2nd British Army, but intelligence failures and strong opposition put the operation off its tight timetables immediately, and the operation ended 10 days later, having failed to secure the final bridge over the Rhine River. In the meantime, the 1st Canadian Army had moved up the coast into Belgium and the Dutch frontier, having lost their chance to quickly clear the Scheldt estuary. A month of heavy fighting began after Market Garden's failure in low-lying Dutch countryside that was in many places flooded by the Germans. The Canadians were fully aware of the importance of the Scheldt, and they needed to knock out the guns on Walcheren Island, but there was no immediate consensus on how best to accomplish it.
Between Antwerp and the sea was the Scheldt estuary, and along this 50-mile channel, 6 German divisions had orders to fight to the death. Canadian correspondents began their record of a fierce and filthy battle. On October 6th, the struggle for the Scheldt would begin.
The failure to advance beyond Antwerp after its capture on 4 September 1944 was one of the most unfortunate Allied strategic errors of the war. Had the British driven just 8 more miles, they would have cut off the Beveland Peninsula and trapped 8 German divisions in the Calais region, whose only hope of escape would have been a highly risky 12-hour sea voyage to Rotterdam in daylight. Instead, the survivors of the German 15th Army threw together a flotilla of Dutch boats and moved from Breskens to Walcheren in darkness, a trip of 45 minutes. In 19 days, 86,000 men and 12,000 vehicles and horses went back into action with the German 1st Parachute Army. Only after the German 15th Army started its evacuation did 1st Canadian Army receive the order to clear the Germans from both sides of the Scheldt estuary. On the day the order was given, 13 September 1944, 1st Canadian Army was still 100 miles to the west trying to clear the French Channel ports. The 2nd Division, unable to batter their way into Dunkirk, broke off their attack, leaving a screening force of Czech soldiers outside the port until the end of the war. The division moved to Antwerp and began fighting their way north on 16 September. The 3rd Canadian Division remained tied up, taking Boulogne and Calais, before moving toward the south side of the Scheldt, where 4th Canadian Armoured Division had already opened the fighting. With the world's eyes on Arnhem, the commander of 2nd Canadian Corps, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, directed his staff to study the problem of capturing Walcheren Island in South Beveland. While the fight for Arnhem was raging, the staff presented Simonds 5 different plans involving the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and amphibious landing craft. Simonds was not impressed, recognizing that clearing the ground south of the Scheldt, a precondition for all 5 options, might not be quickly achieved. His own appreciation stated a need for amphibious landings on Walcheren itself, and he further recommended that the dike should be bombed in order to flood the areas below sea level. He directed the 3rd Canadian Division to clear the land south of the Scheldt, the area that became known as the Breskens Pocket. North of the Scheldt, the 2nd Division was to fight as far west on the Beveland Peninsula as possible. Despite objections by 1st Canadian Army's chief engineer, who felt flooding would inhibit the use of landing craft, the plan was approved by General Eisenhower, who informed the Canadians that 1st Allied Airborne Army refused to release any parachute or glider troops in the belief the plan was poorly suited to airborne forces. On 3 October, Bomber Command did a test run over the dike at Westkapelle, and results exceeded expectations. The Germans quickly dammed the dike to contain the flood, but follow-up bombing raids at Flushing on 7 October, and then Vera on 11 October turned Walcheren into what looked like a saucer filled with water. Denied the use of airborne troops, Simonds directed that Walcheren be attacked with British commandos in a newly arriving division, the 52nd Lowland. Ironically selected for Alpine training, the 52nd was the only mountain division of the British Army, a role intended to keep alive the fiction that the Allies might invade Norway in order to keep German garrisons tied down even after the landings in Normandy. Their planned deployment north of Arnhem never materialized after the collapse of Market Garden, and they arrived south of the Scheldt, while the Breskens Pocket was steadily reduced by the 3rd Canadian Division. The 2nd Canadian Division successfully cut the line of communication to South Beveland at great cost, permitting the division to fight west through South Beveland, joined by troops of 52nd Lowland Division who linked up with the Canadians at Gravenpolder on 28 October. The next day, 29 October, the last Germans withdrew across the Sloedam to Walcheren Island, where coastal guns located on high ground still denied Allied shipping a safe transit of the Scheldt estuary into Antwerp. Four days after General Eisenhower took command of Allied ground forces on the continent, the Germans welcomed back Field Marshal von Rundstedt as Supreme Commander on the Western Front. He had been dismissed from that post at the start of July 1944 following disagreements with Hitler about the conduct of the Normandy campaign, but returned after the disruption caused by the July 20 assassination attempt. While the Allies were disadvantaged by their longer supply lines at the start of September 1944, the Germans were equally disadvantaged by the length of the front line. In July, 62 divisions had been available to hold 100 miles of front. After the Allied breakout, Army Group B had just 25 divisions to hold 400 miles of front. The Germans were also aware of the importance of Antwerp, and the 15th Army was ordered to defend the Scheldt as far forward as possible. Scheldt Fortress North and Scheldt Fortress South were established to guard the waterway. Even when it became clear the Allies had made crossing the Rhine a priority, the Germans resolved that defense of the Scheldt was more important than strongly counterattacking the long corridor that the Allies had opened to Arnhem. Where the Germans erred, however, was in thinking the Allies would turn west after crossing the Rhine. Montgomery's plan was to turn east and then south into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The Germans effectively smashed the British bridgehead over the Rhine by the start of October, and once again firmed up a continuous line of resistance from the Channel coast to the Swiss border. Reinforcements were sent to the Scheldt in the form of Battle Group Chill, based around the 85th Infantry Division. On 9 October 1944, von Rundstedt's estimate of the situation was that the greatest danger to the 15th Army lay north of Antwerp, where the enemy is attempting to establish land communications with Walcheren. Walcheren itself had been garrisoned since July 1944 by the German 70th Infantry Division. The Germans had begun drafting men with lower medical categories and grouping them together to aid in provisioning. For that reason, the 70th was nicknamed a white bread or stomach division, as many of its troops were low-category men with stomach ailments who required special diets. This map, prepared by the Dutch resistance, plotted the positions of the German rearguard left east of the Sloedam by the 70th Infantry Division when it retreated onto Walcheren Island. 2 150mm guns and 4 70mm guns were placed along the dike. Further inland was a position with 2 70mm guns and 4 150mm guns. In between, 2 pieces of 70mm artillery were emplaced near a burnt-out farm. This was all arrayed behind an arc of machine guns and barbed wire, with positions connected by field telephone. In all, about 200 soldiers manned these positions, including 2 platoons of the 2nd Battalion of Grenadier Regiment 1019. They did not yet know that the advance elements of the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade was on a collision course with their outposts. The 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade advanced rapidly through the vacuum left by the retreating Germans. The Essex Scottish Regiment took Neudorp at 0200 on 29 October and dispatched a patrol to scout the east bank of the Sloe Channel. A company of the Essex also scouted north toward the causeway, finding the German positions manned and waiting. The platoon leader and 1 other man were wounded in the encounter, and despite support from armored cars of the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment, the patrol was pushed back. On 30 October, the Essex Scottish were relieved by the Royal Regiment of Canada, which established a tactical headquarters about 2,500 meters from the causeway. In the meantime, the advance elements of the Royals made contact with the defenses at the east end of the causeway between 1400 and 1500 hours, and withdrew under fire, noting the area was heavily mined. The CO of the Royals ordered an attack on the eastern defenses, but one of the company commanders objected, giving his opinion that a frontal attack would be suicidal. The battalion's second-in-command remembered later that he had never before seen anyone object to an order from the CO and actually succeed in getting the order changed. An alternate plan was drawn up in which the Royals would send A Company up the waterlogged coastal strip, using the dike for cover, and attack the Germans from the rear. The battalion's other 3 rifle companies would attack from landward, both as a diversion and to encircle the defenders. The attack went off at 2 in the morning on the 31st of October, well supported by 2 regiments of 25-pounder artillery and the 4.2-inch mortars and Vickers machine guns of the Divisional Machine Gun Battalion, the Toronto Scottish. With C and D companies making enough noise to mask their approach, A Company moved north through barbed wire mines and booby traps, destroying German defensive positions with the help of flamethrowers. One platoon commander personally silenced a German bunker by rolling a hand grenade through the firing slit. By 0250, less than an hour after the attack started, all 4 companies of the Royals had converged on the eastern end of the Sloedam and were mopping up the outer ring of defenses. More than 150 German prisoners were taken, with a large amount of heavy weapons and equipment, including 20mm flak guns that had been mounted on concrete bunkers. In all, the Royals lost just 6 wounded in the attack. Military crosses were later awarded to Captain John E. Stothers, the commander of A Company that had refused to carry out the original plan, as well as to Lieutenant Maurice G. Barry, the platoon commander that knocked out the pillbox. When the sun came up on the last day of October 1944, commanders on both sides of the Walcheren Causeway knew they would be busy on Halloween. When the sun rose on 31 October 1944, no armed German soldier was left on South Beveland. To the west, the causeway was defended by the 70th Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion, a regular battalion of the 1019th Grenadier Regiment, and elements of 2 fortress battalions. The latter were heavily armed infantry units created for static defense. The 70th Infantry Division's Fusilier Battalion was also located north of the Sloedam. This was in essence a standard infantry battalion tasked with reconnaissance. Several platoons of both light and heavy howitzers from the 70th Divisional Artillery were stationed around the causeway as well. There were no German tanks on Walcheren, but just the day before, the people of Arnhem were startled in the early morning when engineers of the 3rd Company of Pioneer Battalion 170 blew a 30-meter wide crater in the causeway so deep that no Allied tank would be able to pass through. On the other side of the slow channel, it was not yet clear which of the remaining Allied formations would make the actual assault on the causeway, as brigades of both the 2nd Canadian Division and the 52nd Lowland Division were now operating in South Beveland. Only hours after South Beveland was cleared of German troops, the 2nd Division's Reconnaissance Regiment liberated North Beveland with an ad hoc water crossing on ferries and barges, supported by the Toronto Scottish and low-flying Typhoon aircraft. The 450-man German garrison surrendered quickly. In the meantime, General Simmons, acting commander of 1st Canadian Army, ordered the amphibious landing on Walcheren Island to go ahead on the morning of 1 November. An attack on the causeway would be vital in diverting German forces from opposing the British commandos landing at Westkapelle and Flushing. Brigadier Holly Kiefler, the acting commander of 2nd Canadian Division, had pressured the 4th Brigade not to stop east of the Sloedam, but to keep pushing his troops forward onto the island. The 4th Brigade commander protested, insisting fresh troops were required. The 157th Brigade of 52nd Lowland Division fit the bill, and in fact had been ordered a week previously to take over ground operations on South Beveland. Unfortunately, they had still not arrived in force by the time the 4th Brigade pulled out, leaving the 5th Canadian Brigade holding the bag. Like the rest of the 2nd Canadian Division, they were hardly fresh troops, having been in action throughout the month fighting onto the Beveland Peninsula and west across the isthmus. Brigadier McGill did not protest, as he knew from experience it would not spare his brigade from the kind of heavy punishment it suffered in Normandy, or indeed just 3 weeks earlier when he objected to a planned attack at the neck of the peninsula. It went ahead over his protests, and for the Black Watch, his senior battalion, 13 October 1944 became known as Black Friday. The Montreal Regiment hurled itself against German paratroopers entrenched on a railway embankment, bounding an area known as the Coffin due to its shape on their maps. Their first attack saw one of the assault companies reduced to just 25 men. A second attack that day saw another company reduced from 90 men to just 4. Instead of launching a futile protest, McGill began planning the attack of his brigade, and once again promised that a rest would be theirs once the mission was complete. At 1000 hours on 31 October, the battalion COs of the 5th Canadian Brigade were told that the Black Watch would send a fighting patrol across the causeway without artillery support, with the Calgary Highlanders to be prepared to cross the slow channel by boat. The CO of the Black Watch felt a patrol was insufficient, and at 10:40 hours briefed his unit on a full-on battalion assault over the Sloedam. Even during the briefing itself, the companies were already crossing the start line. The war diary noted a grim precaution designating a rendezvous for jeep ambulances. As soon as C Company, in the lead, reached the causeway, mortar and shell fire came down at the east end. Machine gun and rifle fire thickened as the Black Watchmen tried to move down the causeway, but C Company reported at 14:15 hours that they were within 75 yards of the far bank. pinned down by heavy mortar fire. Only one section, from Lieutenant Jodoin's platoon, had made it. Tank support prepared to move up at 14:30, but were finally informed the road had been ripped apart by German demolitions. C Company would have confirmed that, about 400 meters from the German end, they had had to wade through chest-high water to cross the crater. Enemy guns along the bank were sighted to crossfire, and at least one high-caliber weapon was using direct fire from the German end, alternately sending up large plumes of water 200 feet high when the high-explosive rounds fell short, and ricocheting solid shot off a paved road down the causeway, something the Black Watch War Diary laconically noted as hard on the morale of the men. Reports of enemy snipers operating in the marsh beside the causeway also caused concern. By 15:10, with one company commander wounded more than once, the Black Watch began digging in, hopeful of heavy fire support. Artillery was finally arranged at 15:53 hours, but C Company signalers reported the first shells had fallen short by as much as 500 yards. The aim was corrected, but by then visibility was so poor the Canadians couldn't tell where they were landing. The lead platoon of C Company also wanted to report that they were in contact with no fewer than 4 MG-42 machine guns, but were unable to move, pinned down and able only to wait for help. At 17:15 hours, engineers crept forward to assess the causeway, declaring it would take at least 8 hours to fill in or bridge the crater once heavy equipment could operate safely. At 17:30 hours, the CEO of the Black Watch ordered B and D companies to withdraw at first dark, with A Company to follow when ordered, and C Company to pull back to within 200 yards of the end of the causeway to permit a heavy artillery concentration on the far side. After the battle was found the entire supporting field regiment had calibrated their guns to a single faulty weapon, causing the inaccurate fire. At 18:40 hours, B Company pulled back, followed by D at 19:10, leaving behind men to help evacuate C Company's wounded. At 19:30, A Company passed by tactical headquarters on their way out. Evacuating C Company's casualties proved to be impossible, as any sound out on the causeway brought down a deluge of mortar fire and MGs firing on fixed lines. At full strength, the Canadian Infantry Battalion had 480 men in its 4 rifle companies. Black Friday on 13 October had cost the Black Watch 183 killed and wounded. The last half of October, including the causeway fighting, cost them 87 more, including 11 killed, 67 wounded, and 9 missing. Replacements were usually inexperienced men, often deficient in infantry training, and by late October, too few to replace the unit back to full strength. The Calgary Highlanders now took on the task of assaulting the causeway. Just a week earlier, they had cleared the area of the Coffin, where the Black Watch had suffered so badly on the 13th, at the cost of 18 killed and 51 wounded. The CO, Lieutenant Colonel Don McLaughlin, who had joined the regiment as a teenager in the 1920s and commanded it throughout the Normandy fighting, was ordered out for arrest, replaced by the younger Ross Ellis, who had established a reputation for efficiency and bravery. If the change impacted the morale of the Highlanders, so did the constantly changing orders. At about 1800 hours on the 30th, they were told the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry would cross the Slow Channel by boat. At 1000 on the 31st, just before the Black Watch attack commenced, the plan had changed to an assault by the Highlanders in storm boats and the capture of Arnhem. A rehearsal with the boats and engineers was planned for 1700, and Highlander Scout Officer Gord Seller observed the Black Watch attack, noting with dismay the heavy German mortar, machine gun, and gunfire. At 1830 hours, the CO gave his orders for that evening. The channel was considered unsuitable for boats, and the Calgary Highlanders would instead cross the causeway on foot, the same route the Black Watch had taken in their own failed attack. The Calgary Highlanders were to create a bridgehead, with a regiment de Maisonneuves to expand the bridgehead at first light on 1 November.
Command firing!
Ross Ellis and Brigadier McGill realized that heavy artillery support would be key to a successful frontal assault on the causeway. A half-hour-long artillery barrage was laid on for 23:40 hours, with B Company under Frank Nobby Clark to lead the attack. The divisional artillery was augmented by 4.2-inch mortars, Beaufort's anti-aircraft guns, and the 3-inch mortars of the Calgary Highlanders, Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, and the Black Watch. The barrage started on time, dropping concentrations on the west end of the Sloedam and moving out onto the flanking dikes. B Company set off at midnight, making it to the halfway mark before heavy shell and machine gun fire laced into them. Number 12 Platoon, in the lead, had managed to crawl on the south side of the causeway, avoiding most of the enemy fire until stopped by concrete anti-tank barriers studded with railway rails. Close enough to hear the enemy at the western end shouting orders, the lead troops finally came under small arms fire, and most of 12 Platoon was hit, including their commander, Lieutenant Lefroy. Orders to withdraw were sent, but never reached the platoon, who had to lie low as the Germans continued to illuminate the area with flares. It wasn't until 0100 on the 1st of November that Lieutenant Jourdouin and 4 men of the lead section of the Black Watch, still hunkered down in abandoned German soot trenches just 25 yards from the far end of the causeway, could be relieved by the Calgary Highlanders. Unable to go farther, Clark received permission to withdraw. A new plan was drawn up with D Company under Major Bruce Mackenzie to start across the causeway at 0530 under a new fire plan. H hour was delayed to 0545, and the company actually kicked off at 0606, moving into heavy artillery and sniper fire for the 5th Brigade's third attempt to cross the Walcheren Island Causeway. The Military Museums is a collection of galleries under one roof in Calgary, Alberta, including the Calgary Highlanders Regimental Museum and Archives, where, tucked in behind the preserved uniform of Bruce Mackenzie, is a scale model of the Walcheren Causeway. The diorama was completed in 1/35th scale in time for the museum's opening in 1990, and was constructed in consultation with surviving veterans of the regiment, including former company commander Nobby Clark. The model is to scale laterally, showing the true width of the actual causeway, but is compressed linearly. At 1/35 scale, a true representation of the 1,600-meter-long causeway would extend 45 meters, or about 150 feet. The model does, however, show the major features of the battlefield as researched by the museum staff and interpreted by some of the men that fought there.
Surrounded by watery mud, the unprotected center of the causeway forced the Allied troops into direct fire from the German heavy artillery. Yet despite these extreme conditions, the Highlanders did manage to take some prisoners. Colonel Nobby Clark.
By the time the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade arrived there in hot pursuit of retreating Germans, the Germans had breached major dikes, returning surrounding fertile farmlands to the sea. In other words, except for the causeway itself, there was nothing but mud and water all around.
The War Diary notes that D Company was far enough down the causeway at 0652 to identify an extensive German roadblock backed by blockhouses at the far end. The enemy machine gun fire had slackened, but sniping and shelling had D Company pinned down. The next report from D Company at 0830 noted no change in German opposition. Additional artillery in the form of a 2-minute concentration at intense rate was called down, followed by a charge at the machine guns. At 0933, D Company reported it had taken the roadblock, along with 14 or 15 prisoners, and sent a platoon south of the causeway. D Company had no way of knowing they had set foot on Walcheren at just about the same time as the British commandos started landing on the other side of the island. The rest of the battalion went forward, with A Company moving north onto the island and B to the south. C Company didn't move until 1300 and ran into the rear of A Company, which was waiting while Captain Wynne Lasher, the company commander, reconnoitered the ground with his platoon commanders. The German fire had once again become heavy, and C Company had been stopped cold, as was D Company attempting to move west. The German engineers at the west entrance to the causeway had immediately begun heavy counterattacks, making it the only time in the war the Calgary Highlanders had enemy flamethrowers used against them. Sergeant Blackie Lalogue, commanding D Company's lead platoon, bravely picked up German grenades and threw them back before they could explode, an action for which he received a Distinguished Conduct Medal. Major Ellis made the trip to the far end to physically contact the companies at 1545 with Brigade Major George Hees, the senior staff officer of 5th Brigade. They returned at 1610, but word came down that officer casualties were mounting. Wynne Lasher and platoon commander Lieutenant Hoy had been wounded, and Lieutenant John Moffat was killed. Hees, who had no infantry training, volunteered to go back to the Bridgehead and take over A Company. The artillery forward observer, Captain Newman, volunteered to be his second in command. The trio set off back across the causeway at 1625, and Ellis returned to HQ alone just over an hour later at 1730. By now the Germans were threatening to cut off the isolated companies in the Bridgehead, and casualties were mounting, including George Hees, who was also wounded. Nobby Clark later noted that if he hadn't ordered his B Company to withdraw, contact with D would have been lost, as they were pulling back about 300 yards down the causeway. B Company pulled back and off to Sloedam, while A and C formed defensive positions near the cratered area. The unit's war diary noted that fighting along the causeway has been terrific for the last 40 hours, and words are inadequate to express all the difficulties that had to be surmounted to make an advance along the 2,000-yard narrow causeway. The memory of it will live long in the minds of the Calgary Highlanders. Those words, typed into the war diary in November 1944, proved to be prophetic. After digging in on the causeway proper, the Calgary Highlanders waited until after midnight for further orders. In the early hours of 2 November, Le Regiment de Maisonneuves received orders to move forward and on to Walcheren Island. Difficulties in obtaining French-speaking reinforcements meant the unit averaged about 60 men in each rifle company, about half strength. Their orders were to hold open a small bridgehead for the fresh units of British 157th Brigade. The Maisies started out at 0400 under cover of a 45-minute barrage of artillery, 4.2-inch and 3-inch mortars. They found the Germans still unwilling to yield ground on Walcheren Island. The artillery firing in support from 52nd Lowland Division fired 300 yards short into the Calgary Highlanders' positions, delaying the attack of the Maisonneuves and throwing off the timetable of the fire plan. The lead company pressed on, but when the forward platoon was still 300 yards short of the western end, the supporting gunfire suddenly stopped. D Company, under Captain Camille Montpetit, had just 40 men at this point, and orders from McGill to go to ground and hold in place to wait for the British to relieve them were not received. Number 18 platoon in the lead, under Lieutenant Charles Forbes, seized an anti-tank gun and secured their objective, a house 500 yards inland. They soon came under the fire of 3 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Thinking B Company was right behind them, the small band continued fighting in the dark, unaware they were alone on the island but still in contact with their supporting artillery. Dawn broke over a hopelessly confused Bridgehead. The Maisonneuves were greeted by the sight of a German column approaching them from the east, headed for Middelburg. When an enemy tank made an appearance, it was taken out by a rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bomber, while Private J.C. Carrere used a Piat to destroy one of the 20mm guns. As the sun climbed over the western end of the Walcheren Causeway, it seemed things were at an impasse. The officers and men of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade were hopeful that the impending arrival of the 52nd Lowland Division down the Walcheren Causeway would be their salvation. The 52nd had much different ideas. Brigadier J.D. Russell, the commander of the 157th Infantry Brigade, arrived at the headquarters of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade on the evening of the 31st as the Calgary Highlanders were preparing to relieve the Black Watch and renew the attack on the causeway. As former wartime Calgary Highlanders officer Jeffery Williams said in his book, The Long Left Flank, the progress of the battle for the causeway had been watched with keen interest and mounting disbelief by officers of the 52nd Division, as McGill sent 3 battalions in succession along this road of death. Their military instincts were revolted by this violation of a cardinal principle, never to reinforce failure. Williams added that an imperial row had blown up at the headquarters of the 5th Brigade, though historian Terry Copp slightly downplays the discord in his history of the 5th Brigade. What is not in dispute is the fact that Major General Edmund Hakewell Smith, the commander of the 52nd Division, had been opposed to the causeway attack from the beginning. He sent his engineers to the slow channel south of the causeway to find a better spot to cross to Walcheren Island. In the meantime, Major General Charles Folks, acting commander of 2nd Canadian Corps, ordered him to reinforce the Canadians on the Sloedam. On 1 November, Folks had even threatened to fire Hakewell Smith if he didn't mount an attack within 48 hours. Terry Copp felt Hakewell Smith's refusal was understandable, and that the plan to cross to the south was sensible. By the time the Maisonneuves were barely hanging on to their bridgehead, Brigadier Russell was convinced he was out of time and had to act. He only agreed, however, to send as many troops across as the Maisonneuves had on the island, which happened to be the 40-man company of Captain Montpetit. At 0600 on 2 November, 2 platoons of B Company of the Glasgow Highlanders moved across the causeway under extremely heavy fire, while the rest of the battalion relieved the Canadians on the Sloedam itself. Once across, it was impossible to move in the face of heavy enemy fire, and the Glaswegians dug in. The Maisonneuves fought their way to link up with the Scots, and at 1200 hours, both units received orders to withdraw under cover of a smoke screen. The Maisonneuves withdrew from the island for good. That evening, a lieutenant and 3 sappers of the Royal Engineers laid out a path across the southern slow channel with mine tape. Turner had discovered the path through the mudflats the night before, working off aerial photos and personal reconnaissance with one of his sergeants. In the early morning hours of 3 November, the 6th Battalion Cameronians, Scottish Rifles, managed to cross the channel unseen by the Germans, both paddling by boat and then on foot through knee and waist-deep mudflats. Correspondence on file in the Calgary Highlanders archives includes this letter from the CO of the 6th Cameronians. He notes that no photographs were taken during the operation. Viewers may have noticed that much of the footage used in preparation of this video was taken at times and places other than the Sloedam fighting in 1944. The letter goes on to describe how the eventual counterattacks were rebuffed. Reinforced by the 5th Battalion Highland Light Infantry, the Cameronians managed to fight their way north and link up with the Glasgow Highlanders. The Commandos were still fighting for their objectives on the other side of the island, but for the 5th Canadian and 157th Infantry Brigades, the battle for the Walcheren Causeway was finally over.
What's a bard? What does a bard do? What's his job? Well, a bard's job is to make people cry. Really. That's what it boils down to.
There were apparently no war correspondents attached to any of the units fighting near the Sloedam, and so it is difficult to grasp what the battlefield looked like and what the small unit tactics actually were. Like the painting by Charles Forbes shown earlier, this painting by wartime Calgary Highlander Robert Johnson captures well the daunting nature of the unique terrain of the Walcheren Causeway, but can only hint at the answers to other questions. The battle came to the attention of first-person shooter developers, and a playable character in a 2007 game Call of Duty, Roads to Victory, is a Calgary Highlander fighting at the Walcheren Causeway.
Bomber Command did a fine job prepping this place, but damn if Jerry hasn't filled in the causeway quick. We need to secure this causeway and establish a staging area on the island.
But the gameplay is naturally not anything like realistic. This footage was taken from the game Call to Arms, with a fanciful-looking human wave assault into the teeth of the German defenses. The Battle of the Walcheren Causeway briefly gained much wider public recognition when the Dutch film The Forgotten Battle was released in 2020. Budgeted at €14 million, or about $15 million US, the project was the second most expensive Dutch film ever made at the time. Due to strict environmental concerns and the transformation of the Dutch landscape with such things as high-speed rail lines and modern windmills, principal photography was done in Lithuania. The film was released in the Netherlands in December 2020 for a short run and aired on Dutch public television 10 months later. In the years since, it has been streamed in North America and Europe on Netflix to appreciative audiences, sitting in the top 10 foreign language films and accumulating over 60 million watched hours in its first month. Critical response to the film was positive as well. In particular, the movie boasts solid production values and acting, with flawless camera work of such things as the Operation Market Garden Air Armada and a realistic recreation of the Sloedam down to the power poles. The story follows the experiences of several fictional characters from several viewpoints: Dutch civilians living under German occupation, soldiers of the occupying German military, Dutch military volunteers in the German forces, members of the Dutch resistance opposing the occupation forces, and Allied soldiers of the British and Canadian armies, intent on liberating the Dutch from the Germans. History buffs find less to like about the story, a contrived intersection of a Dutch soldier serving with the Germans, a British glider pilot, and a female Dutch resistance soldier. The story and its timelines are murky, and the British glider pilot is shot down on September 17, 1944, and joins in on the assault of the Walcheren Causeway, apparently having spent 6 weeks behind enemy lines. Perhaps the most ahistoric element of the film is the depiction of the battle for the Causeway. The film shows the first attack of the Black Watch on the 31st. The soldiers on screen wear Black Watch insignia and are attacking in daylight. The Germans are shown in fortified defensive positions with an 88mm gun firing in support. Beyond these correct cosmetic aspects, though, the on-screen depiction seems fanciful. Black Watchmen are shown, not unlike the video games just mentioned, bunched up and simply running into German machine gun fire. The subsequent 2 days of attacks by the Calgary Highlanders are omitted entirely, as is the relief by regimental Maisonneuves. The Sloedam is flanked in the film by the 52nd Lowland Division at night, though the real-life Royal Engineers that orchestrated the crossing of the Sloe are ignored in favor of giving credit to the fictional Dutch resistance characters in the film. Expecting the film to be a perfectly accurate depiction of history is naturally unrealistic. Researchers have to look deeper, and for all the visual excitement of the film and video game presentations of the assault on the Causeway, this interview of Calgary Highlander veteran Lyle Ricker by journalist and retired Colonel Mike Vernon probably gives a much more accurate glimpse at how troops actually managed to move down the 1,600-meter causeway in broad daylight.
The causeway, when I was in the mortar platoon at that time, and of course being in the mortar platoon, we were behind the rifle companies. And we did get into position behind something or other of a house, and we had a case of empty mortar shells higher than the house was that we were trying to hide behind. It was quite a narrow road. I try to remember that's all it was, just a little road out there, and it was the ocean on both sides, and you couldn't. Like I say, I was in the mortar platoon, and we were behind the rifle companies at that point. But you couldn't live out there without some protection, or you had a choice. You got to crawl along the bank between the water and the dike, and of course everybody didn't want to get wounded and fall into the water because it wasn't. I don't think it was terribly deep there. Most of the places it wasn't. But if you got wounded, it wouldn't matter. You were drowned anyway.
To sum Ricker's comments up, the troops either crawled or did short dashes along the sides of the causeway using the dike for cover, and did so under massive covering barrages of high explosive artillery and mortar fire. While many of the precise details of what actually happened on the causeway are now lost to time with the passing of those that fought there are still many reminders for the rest of us that soldiers from 5 different countries turned the Sloedam into a battlefield on 2 different occasions during the Second World War. Two of the officers who fought at the Sloedam worked tirelessly to ensure the Battle of the Walcheren Causeway had an enduring legacy. Frank Clark, known by his standard-issue nickname of Nobby, survived his command of B Company and stayed in the Calgary Highlanders after the war, commanding it from 1959 to 1962. During his time as CO, he proposed that Walcheren Causeway become the unit's signature battle of the Second World War, to be commemorated annually as representative of all the battles that the regiment had fought in Northwest Europe. Over the years since, that has happened on days close to October 31st, with an annual mess dinner and ceremonial parade to which the local Dutch community have been welcomed to give thanks for their liberation from the Nazis. Likewise, Charles Forbes continued his career with Le Regiment de Maisonneuves after 1945, and in 1986 attempted to raise funds for a permanent monument on the west side of the causeway. With help from the Dutch Royal House, a stone monument was erected in 3 languages and unveiled on 31 October 1987 by His Royal Highness Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. In attendance were veterans of all 3 Canadian regiments, and the Minister of National Defence, the Honourable George Hees, who had briefly commanded A Company of the Calgary Highlanders during the Causeway fighting. Also there was Nobby Clark, with the serving commanding officer of the Highlanders, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Dennis, the Regimental Sergeant Major Bill Toes, and Pipe Major Robert Henderson. Pipe Major Henderson was inspired by a conversation with Nobby Clark, who mentioned the company march of B Company had been Bonnie Dundee. Henderson reworked the melody to compose a slow march entitled the Sloedam, which has since become the unofficial slow-time march past for the Calgary Highlanders. The monument to the Canadians stands beside similar monuments to the French troops who fought there in 1940 and to the 52nd Lowland Division that finished the 1944 battle. Students from Dutch schools on Walcheren Island maintain the site and conduct services there on Dutch Remembrance Day every May. In early 2008, the original monument site had to be altered to accommodate new rail and road work. The view to the east end of the former Sloedam was blocked by a new rail line, and so a raised viewpoint was incorporated into the landscaping so that the Canadian line of departure could be seen from the monument. At about the same time the original Canadian monument was dedicated, Scottish-born entertainer Jack White was employed by the Calgary Highlanders as the regimental bard. Among his musical and poetic compositions was a spoken-word tribute to the spirit of the battle, which was recorded for posterity as part of the Regimental Pipes and Drums' first professional recording in 1990.
Walcheren Causeway, October 31st, 1944. I recall I sat on the porch that night, sipping whiskey, straight and neat, watching tiny goblins and lanterns bright flitting up and down the street. But I don't recall his approach at all. He just suddenly came into view, standing straight and tall by my garden wall, and I greeted him as I greet you. "Good evening, soldier. God save the Queen. Sit down, man, and slake your thirst with some good malt scotch." "Sure," he said. "I'll be happy to toast Halloween." Halloween 1944.
The words have also been included in the regimental history published in April 2024.
Then his voice said clearly, "To Walcheren, don't forget."
Like most historical events, the importance of the two battles at the Walcheren Island Causeway has been continually reassessed in the years since, and a number of similarities between the two events can be discerned, as well as some interesting distinctions. In the 1940 action, the SS Division's first thought was to try and seize both ends of the Sloedam by a quick movement through a disorganized enemy. This was also the first thought of the 2nd Canadian Division in 1944. In both cases, reconnaissance patrols showed these optimistic situation appraisals were unrealistic. In both battles, the initial attempt to cross the causeway was repulsed, and reinforced the knowledge that strong fire support from artillery and even aircraft was needed to achieve a crossing in the face of determined resistance. In both cases, enemy counterattacks punished the attackers, but proved ultimately too weak to eliminate the threat from the Sloedam altogether. In 1940, the French and Dutch defenders proved to be too disorganized and intent on escape through Flushing to prolong their resistance, whereas the Germans in 1944 seemed more determined, though with Walcheren Island flooded behind them, perhaps they had little choice.
Eine Parade über die Avenue Foch beschließt diese Stunde der Ehrung.
Neither the 1940 or the 1944 action seems to have altered the course of the war in any remarkable way. The escape of a few thousand Dutch and French soldiers through Flushing did nothing to prolong resistance elsewhere, and indeed the Netherlands had already surrendered by the time the shooting stopped at the Sloedam. In 1944, possession of Walcheren Island was far more crucial, given the importance of Antwerp as a supply base. In fact, Antwerp remained a strategic target for the Germans long after it was captured by the Allies, and was the prime objective of the counteroffensive through the Ardennes in December. But whether or not the 2nd Canadian Division and 52nd Lowland Division appreciably sped the taking of the island and the silencing of the coastal batteries is perhaps the most contentious historical question surrounding the two battles. The fighting on Walcheren carried on after the withdrawal of the Canadians until November 10th, when the last guns overlooking the Scheldt were finally cleared. Jeffery Williams noted that the Germans saw the flooding of the island as their worst problem, one that had made their position untenable, and concluded the flooding likely resulted in Antwerp being open to shipping 2 weeks earlier than if the dikes had never been bombed. On 26 November, the last mines were swept from the Scheldt, and on 1 December, the first convoy docked with 10,000 tons of stores.
Thanks to British and Canadian troops who cleared the approaches to Antwerp, the first Allied supply ship sails into the liberated harbor, a Canadian-built Victory ship. Admiral Ramsey, Royal Navy, a Dutch admiral, and representatives of the United Nations Army and Naval Staffs welcome the Fort Cataraqui on arrival. The skipper receives congratulations.
And while the first ship down the channel was Canadian, no one from 1st Canadian Army was invited to attend the large host of Allied military dignitaries who met her as she docked.
Soon munitions, petrol, and vehicles will...
The author of Walcheren 1944 dismisses the Causeway Battle, and indeed all of the fighting for South Beveland that preceded it, as an unnecessary expenditure of human life to gain territory that had little value, but concedes that it forced the Germans to concentrate their forces on Walcheren Island, and provided a useful distraction tying up forces away from the main landings at Flushing and Westkapelle. Terry Copp, not surprisingly, offers the most detailed strategic critique, opining that the battle for the Causeway was not the ill-conceived disaster that it is so often portrayed as. He felt, like Richard Brooks, that diverting German attention toward the Causeway was a necessary component of the plan to capture the island, and that the operation was carried out with considerable skill and relatively small losses. Copp is also of the opinion that if 157th Brigade had been better able to exploit the Calgary Highlanders' successful forging of a bridgehead, operations would have developed much more quickly, including an earlier capture of Arnhem. Copp would likely agree it is also a slightly unfair criticism, since just as had happened to the 2nd Canadian Division in Normandy, 52nd Lowland was fighting its very first battle, and it was rare for formations new to battle to perform to their maximum potential. The SS Verfügungsdivision may have been an exception, and that formation was expanded to the Waffen-SS after 1940, no doubt on the strength of its creditable performance in the field. According to researcher Richard DeVoe Maxwell, the Deutschland Regiment in particular had led the division throughout the campaign and rewarded its commander and one of their battalion commanders the Knight's Cross for their conduct in action, losing just 6 officers, 18 NCOs, and 72 other ranks in the entirety of the 1940 campaign. The casualty toll suffered during the 1940 and 1944 actions at the Causeway also invite comparison. The SS had suffered 15 killed and 45 wounded in their attacks on the Causeway. The Canadian battalions had similar numbers. The Black Watch had 14 killed and 43 wounded, the Calgary Highlanders 19 killed and 45 wounded, and the Maisonneuves 1 dead and 10 wounded, though the latter is deceptive as they only deployed 2 platoons on Walcheren Island itself. At least 3 Calgary Highlanders were taken prisoner after being wounded, but since the Germans had no way to evacuate them from the island, they were out of enemy hands in only a few days. The French fighting at the Sloedam in 1940 and the Germans in 1944 were in a similar situation of fighting for a side destined to lose, but whose complete surrender was not yet imminent. The losses of Allied troops defending the Causeway in 1940 of 35 dead and 99 wounded can't be compared directly to those of the 70th Infantry Division, as there don't appear to be detailed statistics broken down by date. The 70th Division as a whole surrendered in November 1944 and was struck from the German order of battle. Aside from the monuments already discussed, there are a few other reminders of the fighting in the vicinity of the former Causeway. The slow channel no longer exists as reclamation efforts have increased since 1945. There are a few bunkers left, though most played no part in the actual fighting, an exception being these flak bunkers which housed 20mm guns and once taken were used as a useful shelter from German mortar fire by the Canadians. This Tobruk, for example, a one-man position, was created to guard against attack from west to east in the event of an Allied amphibious landing on Walcheren, followed by an advance onto South Beveland, the exact opposite direction to the 2 actual assaults of 1940 and 1944. The causeway itself can still be discerned as the high-speed rail line follows its course. Remnants of anti-tank and anti-glider obstacles remain at the western edge. Many of the surviving Atlantic Wall fortifications reside on private property, for which permission to access them must be granted. These photos were taken in 2010, and I am grateful to retired Warrant Officer Dre Pompin of the Dutch Commando Museum and retired Sergeant Denny Russell of the Calgary Highlanders for arranging the tour. The British and Canadian regiments that fought at the Sloedam and the Dutch people who live in the area have rightly memorialized the sacrifice of the soldiers in 1944 who fought to liberate the Netherlands. The soldiers that fought there tended to be less sentimental. According to Jeffery Williams, Ross Ellis had called their mission a bad deal and the terrain a stinky hole. Floyd Rourke survived the Causeway fighting to be awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal in the last days of the war, when as a lance corporal he took command of his platoon when the officer and NCOs were hit, taking out a German gun and several prisoners. Asked about the Causeway fighting at the annual commemoration in 2001, all that came to mind was relief that it was all over. Charlie Forbes, the gutsy commander of No. 18 Platoon, who held on across the slope for hours under heavy fire, waiting for relief by the 52nd Lowland, asked long after the war about his experiences, summed up that feeling of relief very well when he described his return to Canada.
Ce que j'avais perdu, ce que j'avais aimé. Mon père pleurait. C'était tough, mon père. Je jouais mon chien, j'avais un coquin. Je lâche un cri. Basta! Il part de là, puis il m'a sauté dans le cou. Puis là, je suis parti à pleurer.